So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the GRACE series dedicated to climate education. Our topic today is democracy and climate, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our distinguished speaker, Professor Diarmuid Torney, who's Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government of Dublin City University, and also co-director of the DCU Centre for Climate and Society. Before we start our webinar and I give the floor to our speaker, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the GRACE coordinator, Dr. Tiziana Faitini, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. I would also like to greet and thank our tutors, Agostino Cambise, Ryan Licata, Mike Orr, Luisa Broli, and Jennifer Hill for their valuable help during the sessions and also behind the scenes. As I said, Professor Torney is Associate Professor at DCU University, and academically, he is a recognized expert in climate change, politics, policy, and governance. And beyond academia, he is active in various expert working groups and also influential roles contributing to national and international climate policy efforts, whose research focuses on finding effective governance solutions for transformative climate action, including the role of public participation. He is also the coordinator of a Horizon Europe project focused on strengthening democratic governance for climate transitions. And this project is called Retool. And I'm going to post the address for that, the URL for that. So today, Professor Torney will share insights on why democracies often struggle to tackle climate change and how they can overcome these challenges using a unique case study from Ireland involving the Children and Young People Assembly on biodiversity loss. The title of his webinar today is Democracy and Climate: How can we achieve our climate targets while strengthening and reinvigorating democratic governance? So please join me in welcoming Professor Diarmuid Torney. Thank you very much, Professor Torney. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Daniela, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in your webinar series. Hopefully you're hearing me well and seeing my presentation on screen. So I'm delighted to be joining you, and thanks also to my colleague, and in a way your colleague as well, Professor Louisa Parks from the Department of Sociology in the University of Trento, who was the connection to this project. Louisa is the University of Trento is a partner in the Retool project, and so that was the connection and how the invitation to me came about. So as Daniela said, the topic of my talk this evening is democracy and climate change, democracy and environmental policy. And this is, I suppose, at the forefront of many people's minds with what we have seen play out over the last week and a half. It's just over a week since we in Europe woke up to the news that Donald Trump has been elected, and so what played out in the US election and the news indeed overnight that the Republican Party has held on to the House of Representatives, creates challenging circumstances for environmental policy and governance at the global level. And so, as Daniela said in her introduction, there are three parts to my presentation. So the first one, the first part, and to an extent the second part, are a little bit more on the theory side. So some of the ideas and concepts from relevant academic literature on why democracies struggle to address climate change, and how we can better equip democratic governance institutions to tackle climate change. But I also wanted to give a practical example in this talk so that we don't remain in the realm of theory for the whole talk. And so, as Daniela said, in the second part of my presentation, I want to describe a case study from Ireland that I was involved in around about 2 years ago, which was a Children and Young People's Citizens Assembly on the topic of biodiversity loss. So that will be the second half or so of the presentation. But to come back to the bigger question of why democracies sometimes struggle to address climate change, I wanted to step back from the topic of climate, biodiversity, in environmental policy, and paint a broader picture of the state of democracy in the world. And so here I've taken last year's report from Freedom House. So there are a number of these types of assessments every year. The Economist Intelligence Unit, for example, does a similar exercise where over time these independent assessments have tried to capture, if you like, the state of democracy around the world. And so each of these different organizations measures democracy in slightly different ways, but they're all quite nuanced, quite multifaceted measures of democracy, looking at things like, are elections free and fair? Is there an independent judiciary? How free is the media? Those kind of classic institutions of democracy. And so, as I said, different organizations measure democracy in somewhat different ways, but they all paint, I guess, broadly the same picture. And so what I have on this slide is some of the findings from last year's Freedom in the World report from the organization Freedom House. And so, overall, and this probably won't come as a surprise, unfortunately, their key findings from last year's report are that global freedom has declined for the 17th consecutive year. And I should have said, and you can see in the top left of the cover page, this was a milestone for Freedom House because this was the 50th anniversary edition of their report. So they were painting this this picture over the recent past, but also looking at the bigger picture over that 50-year period. And this charts the pattern of, as they identified, 17 years of democratic decline. And so what you're seeing here is that, so they, as I said, it's a multifaceted score, but what they come up with an aggregate score for each country in terms of the strength of democracy. And then that allows them to measure on a year-by-year basis whether an individual country's, the strength of its democracy is improving or disimproving. And then aggregating across the whole world, what this chart shows is for each year since 2005, the number of countries that have improved the quality or strength of their democracy and the number of countries that have disimproved or declined. And so what you can see here is that for each of the 17 years, and this is where the 17 years of democratic decline line comes from, is that for each of the years since 2005, that the number of countries disimproving or declining in their score is greater than the number of countries that have improved. And apologies, it's since 2006, so 2005, I think, was the last year that the improved score was higher than disimproved score. But you can see for 2022 that the numbers are almost even. It's just tipping the balance, 35 versus 34. But the big takeaway from this is essentially that democracy is being challenged in various countries around the world, and that's probably an impression that most people have. And this is just to say that if you like, the data and some of the attempts to measure this back that up. So that's the general context, which is admittedly not a great way to start. Now, zooming in more specifically to the question of democracies and their attempts to address climate change. In the literature, we can see a number of reasons that are put forward for why democratic governance in particular struggles to handle climate change. So one of these is around time horizons. So we know that climate change is both, it's a long-term problem. It requires action today to benefit and the benefits will accrue partly today, but partly in the future. So that sets up a tension between short-term and long-term priorities. And in democracies, politicians will typically face the electorate every 4 or 5 years, sometimes shorter, but rarely longer than that. And that creates incentives for elected politicians and those seeking election to focus on the short term rather than the long term. A second strand is that democracies sometimes struggle to find appropriate or adequate ways to incorporate expert evidence in decision making. So, for example, not scientific knowledge around climate change. We to some extent this is improving, and I'll give some examples later in the talk. But that's a challenge for democratic decision making. A third is around the power and role of special interest groups. So we know that the challenge of addressing climate change successfully means tackling vested interest groups, for example, fossil fuel industries and the like. And those sorts of special interest groups often have very effective ways of lobbying the political system in democratic systems. And finally, a final strand is around the responsiveness of democracies to public opinion. Now, this is certainly, you could argue this one either way, because that is, arguably a core tenet of democracy, that decision making is responsive and accountable to the public. That's one of the characteristics of democracy. But if the public are not sufficiently motivated and mobilized around the need for near-term climate action, even though they may not see the benefits for the longer term, then that can create challenges for politicians that would wish to take climate action. So that's just to give some of the overview of why democracies struggle to adequately address climate change. One other important thing to say, of course, is that democracies come in many shapes and sizes. So it's not that we have just one model of democracy. We have all sorts of different ways. And in this table, which I've taken from a book, a very short and accessible book by Daniel Fiorino, published in 2018, called Can Democracy Handle Climate Change? Which, if you're looking for further reading on this topic, it's a few years ago now, but I would recommend this book. He sets out these different characteristics of different ways in which democratic systems can vary, and identifies what the research suggests in terms of what those characteristics mean for climate action. So the first of these is the number of veto points. So the veto points in the political science literature is basically a term for points in the decision-making system where actors can hit the stop button, can press pause, can object to a policy proposal. And so it's not surprising that the more of those points in the decision-making system that we have, the more it's likely that climate action measures will be effectively limited or constrained. The second, a second design feature, if you like, of democratic systems is the electoral rules under which politicians are elected. And PR, apologies for the acronym there, that's proportional representation. For example, in my country here in Ireland, we have a system of proportional representation. Many countries have the same kind of electoral system, where the outcome of the the elections in terms of the number of seats is more or less proportional to the overall votes that parties get in the election. But if we look at the country next door to me, well, actually, either side of Ireland, there's a big ocean on one side of Ireland. If we look to Ireland's east, to Britain, they use an electoral system called first past the post, which is basically one candidate elected per constituency, and the candidate winning the most votes, even if it's not a majority, is elected. Similarly, in the United States too, though a lot further to Ireland's west, we have a similar system. I won't get into the details of the electoral college system for presidential elections, but all of which is to say, electoral rules matter, because in first past the post systems, you typically get two parties emerging. Not always, but you typically get two dominant parties, and parties with smaller vote shares, such as Green parties, are often squeezed out by that electoral system in a way that they typically get the greater seat share in elections in proportional representation systems. So those smaller parties that might be more of a voice for climate action do better in proportional representation systems. A third design characteristic of democratic systems is whether power is concentrated at the federal level, or in the sense of a country being a unitary system, or is there strong devolution to subnational units? For example, in the Länder system in Germany. The research is unclear on that. A fourth is patterns of governance, so neo-corporatist systems. That's a term for decision-making systems that give a strong voice to social partner organizations such as trade unions and business groups in decision making. And those systems that are more inclusive of stakeholder voices tend to be better at reaching agreement and implementing policies. But on the other hand, the level of ambition can sometimes be less because those voices are included. Degree of consolidation basically captures whether a democracy has recently become a democracy or has been a democracy for a long time. So you compare again, to keep returning to my own direct experience here in Ireland, but we recently celebrated 100 years of being an independent democratic country versus some of the countries in the former Soviet bloc who democratized only in the 1990s. The research shows that the longer a country has been a democracy, the better typically it is at addressing climate change. Not surprisingly, dependence on fossil fuels increases the transition costs and thereby constrains climate action. And then finally, economic inequality matters. So in deeply unequal societies, collective action of the kind that we need to tackle climate change can be more difficult to achieve than in more equal societies. So that's just to set up some of the broader trends and concepts when we think about democracy and climate change. I want now just for a minute to turn to a radically different perspective on this topic, which you might have heard or you might even have thought yourself. And the argument, the argument sometimes goes, if only we were more like China. If only we could, we being countries characterized by democracy, didn't have to deal with elections and the public who get in the way, we would have a much better chance at achieving strong climate action. And that argument has a term, or has a couple of terms in some of the academic debates. So it's sometimes called eco-authoritarianism or green authoritarianism, and it's basically the argument that we need to insulate decision making from democratic control in order to achieve our climate goals. And so I've put a couple of quotes here from a contribution from Gilly from a little over 10 years ago. So the idea is to concentrate authority in a few executive agencies manned by capable and uncorrupt elites seeking to improve environmental outcomes. And in terms of public participation in decision-making, that's limited in this view of the world, this kind of normative view that we need eco-authoritarianism. So it's public participation is limited to a specific cohort of people, that is scientists and technocratic elites, whereas the rest of the population are invited to participate only to pursue implementation of climate action. But what that climate action looks like in this view of the world is having a say over those decisions is limited to these, if you like, these uncorrupt elites, scientists and the technocratic elites. So that's kind of the whole other end of the spectrum. And that's an argument that finds some favor within some academic literature, but it's also, as I said, used sometimes in reference to China. But from my perspective, discussions around Chinese environmental policy are often overly simplistic. That eco-authoritarian argument around the power of China to transform its economy really misses some of the complexity of domestic politics in China. And the reason it misses the complexity of domestic politics is that it's not played out in public. So we don't see media reports about these tensions between different interest groups, but they're still there. And so the tensions between economic, energy, and climate priorities that we see in other countries are actually there under the surface all along in China, but they're not played out in public, and there aren't leaks to the media or media reports or politicians speaking openly. So we don't get to see it in daylight. There are also challenges in China in terms of implementation at local level. So China is a huge, vast country, and so it's not always the case that what Beijing decides is unquestioningly implemented at local level in China. So that's an attempt to set the overall scene. In the next part of my talk now, I want to turn from, if you like, diagnosing the problem to fleshing out some more theoretical and conceptual ideas around how democratic governance can be better equipped to tackle climate change. Excuse me. And this will set the scene or set the context for the case study that I'm going to talk about then in the final part of my talk. So if we think and if we look at the literature and practice in this area, there are, and if we stay within the realm of democratic governance, so we decide we don't want to go all the way to the eco-authoritarian or green authoritarian position, that we hold dear our institutional democratic decision making, but we want to tweak it. There are broadly speaking, two versions of this perspective. One argues that we need less democracy, but not no democracy, and the other argues that we need, in fact, more democracy. So the less democracy argument essentially is a version of that eco-authoritarian argument, but not taking it to its full extent, but in some way delegating decision-making or authority to the experts. And in the more democracy camp, we have over the last decade or two growing scholarship, research, but also interesting practices around deliberative democracy. So to focus first, to keep attention first on the less democracy argument, one of the ideas underpinning this approach is what economists sometimes call the time inconsistency problem. So let me explain what that means. It's basically, it comes back to that idea I talked about earlier in my talk about short-term versus long-term. Basically that governments have an incentive to change their minds, to renege on their commitments. So they want to set ambitious long-term climate targets, but they'll always have an incentive to change course and to abandon those policies if they're in some way unpopular. And so the economic literature in this area goes way back to the 1970s, and so the research in that area argued that what we need is what economists would call commitment devices to allow governments to credibly commit to policy stability. So what does that mean? That means basically politicians voluntarily tying their hands and saying, we are committing to this program of policies, and we're not going to renege on those policy priorities. And so one prominent example from a different policy field would be independent central banks. So in the 1990s, there was a wave of reforms to central banks around the world, and based on some of this economic research, saying that governments will always have an incentive, elected politicians will always have an incentive to intervene to set the interest rates in a way that benefit the short-term interests, but that harm the long-term interests of the economy. And so governments around the world decided to set up independent central banks that had the authority to set interest rates, to that core part of economic policy, But they were independent in the sense that governments couldn't fire the central bankers. So they had this great power to set interest rates, but also they were insulated from being fired. So that's a very prominent example of a commitment device of this kind. If we turn then to what this looks like in the context of climate governance, we haven't seen quite the same process played out. So the analogy of an independent central bank have been debated and teased out in the academic literature, but actually when it's come to setting up new institutions to bring expert voices into climate change decision making, those bodies have all been advisory in nature rather than that example of an independent central bank where the central bankers actually get to make the policy. And so one of the early examples of an institution of this kind was and is called, it's still around, the committee, the Climate Change Committee, which was set up in the UK under the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act. Here in Ireland, we have a similar kind of body, the Climate Change Advisory Council, which was set up under legislation in 2015 and then strengthened under amending legislation passed in 2021. And at the European level, at the EU level, there is now a European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. So, and what all of these bodies have in common is that they are composed of experts of different kinds. And those experts make recommendations on things like what the climate targets should be, and also they monitor government progress. But importantly, and in contrast to the example of independent central banks, these expert bodies in climate policy don't have executive decision making. So they don't get to make climate policy, they just get to make recommendations to government on what climate policy should be, what targets should be in place, and so forth. So it's not quite putting the experts in charge, but it is an attempt to give a stronger voice in the decision-making process to experts. Another example of a commitment device is what are sometimes called framework climate laws. So these are high-level legal frameworks that do a whole range of things, but coming back to the idea of a commitment device, what these pieces of legislation do is they enshrine climate change targets in law. So here in Ireland, so this is a map of Europe, and the map is a little bit dated, so there may have been some updates in the last year and a bit, but this is broadly correct. And so you can see many European countries, though not Italy, have these framework climate change laws that enshrine in law climate change targets and then put in place a whole load of governance aspects that you can see in the bullet point list there. But the point of enshrining this in law is that it's harder to reverse. So if a new government comes in, it's not impossible for them to change course to reverse, but enshrining targets rather than just putting them in a policy document makes them harder for subsequent governments to roll back. So that's another example of a commitment device. I want now to turn to the other side of the argument, that more democracy argument that I described earlier, and to talk a bit about deliberative democracy and what it might have to contribute to our attempts to address climate change. So the whole idea of deliberative democracy is certainly not new. It has its origins in Athenian democracies millennia ago. It contrasts with both representative democracy, where we elect politicians to represent us in decision making, and also direct democracy, where we collectively as a population make decisions through referenda. It's a slightly different version of democracy, and it really places an emphasis on the discussion process, the deliberative process through which we arrive at collective decisions. So it emphasizes the open, inclusive, and public decision making that includes all affected citizens on equal terms. It's not just the aggregation of individual preferences, so it's not like an election every 5 years, or even something like an opinion poll. It really places that emphasis on deliberation, on reasoned debate, and arriving at collective decisions that way. And so if we think about what deliberative democracy has to offer to a problem like climate change, the research, the political science, and also psychological research in this area shows that these processes of deliberation are well equipped to deal with policy challenges that are complex, long-term in nature, and involve value conflicts and trade-offs between different competing goals. And climate change is, this is almost like a description of the characteristics of climate change. So it's a deeply complex challenge. It is long-term in nature, and it involves deep value conflicts about what priorities we should, what goals we value and should prioritize, and trade-offs between different valid interest groups. And one of the most I would say eye-catching and high-profile ways of putting deliberative democracy, this idea, into practice is through something called a citizens' assembly, which is basically where you bring together a randomly selected group of the population. So they're not interest groups. They're not people with particularly strong, or they're not necessarily people with particularly strong views. They're ordinary members of the public, but they're selected in a manner that means they are representative of the wider public in terms of important demographic characteristics. So, for example, you might have a group that is roughly equal in terms of men and women that are geographically distributed. They live across the region in question, that are spread that are diverse in terms of income, in terms of ethnicity, and so a citizens' assembly brings together a group of people, a random but representative group of people in theory. It gives them access to relevant information, but it importantly gives them a space to deliberate with other members of the public that might have quite different views to them. And then there is a decision-making process by which the group collectively agree on their recommendations to government. And then there are various ways in which the recommendations from citizens' assemblies are brought to the policy system, are brought to government. And in this slide, I've included the logos of a range of citizens' assemblies on climate change. This is nowhere near exhaustive, but we have Ireland, the UK, France, Scotland, Denmark, Finland, and Washington State in the US. But this is really just scratching the surface, because according to work earlier this year by the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is a European-wide network studying these institutions, there have been in Europe alone, there have been over 200 citizens' assemblies and similar processes on climate change and other environmental topics over the last number of years. Now, a lot of these have been at the subnational level, but the ones that have got a lot of attention have been these national level ones. And rather than try any further in a theoretical way to tell you what a process like this looks like, I want instead now to move on to the final part of my talk, which is this case study earlier on that I talked about earlier on, which was a citizens' assembly, but focused on the population of children and young people. Excuse me. So this took place in Ireland in 2022, and I led the team that designed and implemented this citizens' assembly, and I love talking about it. It was a very inspiring and empowering process, and so in the rest of my talk, I'm going to tell you a bit about how we went about designing and running it and what has happened since. But on my closing slide, I'll also have some links to the Assembly website and also and from there you can find a video that tells the story and has some very nice footage from the Assembly. So the team that I was involved with was an intergenerational and interdisciplinary team. So there was a group of adults that included me and some of my colleagues here in Dublin City University, but also some colleagues from another university in Ireland, University College Cork, and then an expert from an international NGO that specializes in children's environmental rights called Lettere. But really importantly, we also had a brilliant young advisory team. And so they were, there were 9 of them, and they were aged 8 to 16. Now, this was 2 years ago, so they're all obviously 2 years later now, 2 years older now. And so the oldest one is now 18, and the youngest one is 10. And so Annabelle in the top left there is the older one. She's just started university. I saw her a couple of months ago at an event. So this young advisory team helped us to design and run the process, and it was really important to have them there rather than just a group of adults trying to imagine what a fun and engaging process for children and young people would look like. It was really important to have this group by our side, and so we worked with them over the summer and into the autumn of 2022. The Assembly met over 2 weekends in 2022 in October, but this team of young advisors came on board much earlier in about May or June, I think, and worked with us mostly online over the summer through Zoom calls, but also we brought them together with the adult team in September, about a month before the Assembly, and we had a weekend together designing what we plan to do with the Assembly. So that was the team involved in designing and running it, but who were the participants themselves? So I started to describe earlier how a recruitment process for a citizens' assembly works, and there are a couple of terms for this process. Democratic lottery is one term. A more technical term is a stratified random sample, where it's basically a random sample, but it's stratified by important demographic characteristics. And so we issued a call for applications for expressions of interest, but in keeping with the principle that these should be ordinary members of the public and not highly motivated people, we didn't ask people why they wanted to take part. We only asked for contact details and so forth, and also their responses to 6 demographic questions. And we selected then, we used a computer algorithm to choose at random a group of 35 assembly members that looked like the total population in terms of these important 6 characteristics. And these were the 6 demographic characteristics that we chose. So gender, ethnicity, urban, rural, whether the participants lived in a city, a town or village, or a rural area, which we thought was important for deliberating on the topic of biodiversity loss, geography, where they lived in Ireland, age. So the total age range was from 7 to 17, and disability status. And so what you're seeing here is the breakdown of those 35, but the proportions that you see here are in proportion to the total population in Ireland under the age of 18, according to the most recent census data that was available when we were designing this process. So that was at the time, the 2016 census of Ireland. And so, for example, you can see on gender, there were 18 female and 17 male, but in terms of ethnicity, notwithstanding that we've had a lot of inward migration over recent decades, Ireland was historically a country of emigration, and so it is still predominantly a white Irish country, and that was reflected in the makeup, that 29 of the 35 were characterized in the census as white Irish. And yeah, you can see the breakdown in terms of the other characteristics as well. So that's what the 35 looked like in terms of these important demographic characteristics. And this is what they looked like in real life. So this was a set of photos that we had taken during the 2nd weekend of the assembly. Not all of the members of the assembly consented to having their photos published in the final report. So not all 35 here are here, but most of them are. And one thing that might not be initially apparent when you see it is that because they are all physically roughly the same size in these photos, you don't get a sense of the age range. But if you look closely, you can see that clearly some of these are much younger children, and some of them are older teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. And so, as I said earlier, the age range was from 7 to 17. And we brought them together over 2 weekends in 2 different parts of Ireland. So one weekend in early October 2022 and one weekend in late October 2022. And so what did it look like in practice? What did we do? Well, we had a range of activities over the 2 weekends. So we had some learning. So this was a colleague from the project, Professor Aoife Daly from University College Cork, leading a session on children's rights and children's participation. So there was some of that kind of expert or teacher-led elements. But there was also a lot of games and different activities that we co-designed with the young advisory team. So you can see some photos of that here. This was my colleague on the project, Katie, working on a collective vision, and I'll come back to what the outputs were in just a couple of minutes. But we also were keen to make sure that there was time for games and activities. We were lucky that, so I don't know if any of you have ever been to Ireland, but Ireland is not renowned for good weather at any time of the year, and certainly not in October. But we were very lucky that we had 3 out of the 4 days were sunny, and so it gave us lots of opportunities to get outside and to build fun and games into the 2 weekends, which is quite a contrast from how citizens' assemblies for adults are usually run. They're often groups of adults sitting down in a hotel function room or a similar space, listening to experts and then discussing in round tables. So we knew that something like that wouldn't really work with a group of children and young people. But importantly also, remember, we were deliberating on the topic of biodiversity loss and how to protect and restore biodiversity. And so we knew that it would be really important to give the children and young people and ourselves an opportunity to get out and experience nature. And so on the afternoon of the first of the 4 days, so it was two weekends, 4 days in total, we went to a local nature reserve, and this is a photo from the nature reserve. And so you can see my colleagues Katie and Ben leading an activity here, and the children and young people searching for something. I can't quite remember what it was, what the activity was on this occasion. But when we asked at the end of the 2 weekends, when we asked the children and young people what their favorite part of the 2 weekends was, nearly everyone said the nature walk. So this was a really important part of the assembly. So so that's just an overview of a glimpse of what the process looked like. And in the discussion afterwards, I'm happy to answer any questions on any of the specifics. But as I said, the assembly, part of the process of a citizens' assembly is coming up with recommendations. And so the Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss came up with a whole load of recommendations, in fact, 58 calls to action. And so we grouped these under 7 themes, which you can see in the colored circles towards towards the bottom of the screen. And the principle there was that we wanted to make sure everyone's voice was heard. So sometimes in processes like this, you might have a voting process to pick the most popular recommendations, or to see if there are majority support for recommendations. We didn't want to turn this into a popularity contest, so instead we took the approach of capturing everyone's recommendations, and we went through a whole process of helping the children and young people to, after they'd learned about the causes of biodiversity loss and some solutions, to come up with kind of action-oriented recommendations. And so we grouped them under these 7 themes, but then we also wanted to have some overall messages. And so that's where those of us in the adult team played a little bit more of a role here. So our job here was to try and pick out some headline messages from the 58 calls to action, and also a vision statement. And so in terms of process, what we did here was to work late into the night on the penultimate day, so this was the Saturday of the 2nd weekend, to try to crystallize what looked to us like important key messages and the vision statement. And then on the Sunday morning, we presented these to the members of the assembly with the question, does this accurately represent what you would like to tell the world? And so we had a discussion on the Sunday morning to tweak and finalize these calls to action, sorry, the key messages and the vision statement. And so that's basically what the recommendations looked like. And so that was on the morning of our 4th day, but the story didn't end there, because we have in fact engaged in, we're now 2 years on, just over 2 years on from the assembly, and the story keeps on unfolding. And in the following slide, and I'm conscious of time, we're coming up to the hour, but I have just a few slides to go, and then we can open up for questions. So in these following slides, I just want to give some snapshots of some of the follow-up activities and the interactions with the national government and local government that have happened. So in these, in the top 2 photos here, and these are from that final day, the Sunday of the 2nd weekend. You can see some children and young people there, but there's also an older man there, and that older man is a minister in the Irish government. His name is Malcolm Noonan, and he had commissioned us to design and run this citizens' assembly. And sorry, I forgot to say at the start that part of the origins of where the proposal to design and run a children and young people's citizens' assembly was that the Irish government had already established a citizens' assembly for the adult population on the topic of biodiversity loss. And this man you see in the photos, Malcolm Noonan, was very strongly of the view that the population under 18 should also have a chance to have their say. And the way citizens' assemblies have historically been designed in Ireland is that the membership is restricted to the population of voting age, which in Ireland is 18 and above. So that's where the whole idea for this Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss came from. So Malcolm Noonan's portfolio in the government includes nature and biodiversity. And so we invited him to join the assembly on the final day of the deliberations to hear from the children and young people themselves. And so those calls to action, the key messages, and the vision statement were presented to him. And as you can see here, he was he spent time going around talking to different members of the group. So that's the top two photos. Then the bottom photo, what you're seeing here is a meeting with one of the local councils, so local government in County Wicklow, which is a county to the south of Dublin, to the south of where I'm based here. And so this was a meeting with the two participants in the assembly, the two girls you can see either side of that mural in the middle. They are the two participants in the assembly who live in that county, and so we brought them to meet with the chief executive of that county council and also some of the elected representatives. So that's one instance of follow-up and legacy activities. There was also a meeting between representatives from the Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss and the Adult Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, which was meeting at the same time but in parallel in a different location. And so in the photo here, you can see the 6 members of the assembly who were chosen to represent the wider membership of the Children and Young People's Assembly, meeting with the woman behind them there is the chair of the Adult Citizens Assembly. And when that Adult Citizens Assembly in March of 2023 published its final report, you can see on the slide there, one of its recommendations to government was that the government should take into account the recommendations from the Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. So we had a nice example of intergenerational dialogue there between these two institutions. Later that year, so later in 2023, so this is now about a year ago, in November of last year, again, a set of representatives from the Children and Young People's Assembly were invited into the National Parliament. So this is the committee of the National Parliament dealing with environment and climate action. And they were tasked with considering the recommendations from both the Adult Citizens Assembly and the Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see there are 6 of the assembly members sitting there, and it was one of the first times that children have been invited into a committee of the National Parliament. And when that parliamentary committee published its report to government on the topic of biodiversity loss, you can see here these recommendations that the calls to action set out in the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss should be examined and considered for implementation by relevant government departments. So another example of impact. Just a few more examples of impact and legacy. The Assembly got quite a lot of media coverage. So this is a few examples of newspaper coverage, local newspapers and national media outlets, some podcasts. National podcasts, and also this is a screenshot of a podcast that is no longer in existence, but was called Reasons to Be Cheerful. It's a British podcast, one of the presenters of which was Ed Miliband, who is now in the UK government. He's now the Secretary of State in the UK government for climate change. So that podcast featured a special episode on the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss. Moving back then to the sphere of policy making, in January of this year, the Irish government published a new national biodiversity action plan covering the period until the end of this decade, and the National Biodiversity Action Plan had a specific page dealing with the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss, and how the calls to action, the recommendations from the Assembly had fed into the formation of the National Biodiversity Action Plan in January of this year. And then finally, I'm bringing this up to the present. So this report has a date of June 2024, but it was actually just published by the Irish government the week before last. So don't just ignore the date on it. It's just been published. But this is the government's official response to the recommendations and calls to action of the Citizens' Assembly and the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss. So that's the process for the adults and the process for the children and young people. And what this document does is it goes through recommendation by recommendation and says what the government is doing in response. And so I have just a couple of screenshots of specific pages from this report. And so, for example, you can see that the first key message was, we must treat the earth like a member of the family or a friend, which I think is a lovely way of expressing this sentiment. So this is the government response, so that the National Biodiversity Action Plan commits to exploring the ways in which the rights of nature could be formally recognised. So in this document, it goes through line by line, recommendation by recommendation, and gives what the government's response is. Just one other page from that report. One of the calls to action was that children and young people should be involved in decision making, so that more children and young people are given the chance to have their say. But scroll down to the next page. And so the government response here is that the National Biodiversity Action Plan provides for the establishment of a Children and Young People's Biodiversity Forum. So it's still under development, but if that was set up, that might be perhaps the biggest long-term impact of the Children and Young People's Assembly. So I'm aware, Daniela, I've gone a little bit over the hour. I just have a concluding slide here with some key takeaways. From my talk, the first of which is that democracy can be strengthened by including the voices of ordinary people, and something like a Citizens' Assembly is a good way of doing that. But in particular, and this was something that I really learned, I hadn't worked with children before being involved in designing the Children and Young People's Assembly, but I worked with colleagues who had a lot of experience in that area. And I really learned the power, discovered the power of children and young people's voices and the new and different perspectives they can bring to different policy challenges. I think another important key takeaway was the importance of co-design. So that working with that young advisory team that I talked about. And finally, and for something like what I've described, that that process of following up and giving feedback on what happened, the recommendations, is really important and gives a sense of being heard. So thanks very much for your attention. As I said earlier, there are a number of different resources available. The Assembly website is still online, cyp-biodiversity.ie. I think the QR code links to the website. We have a video online that tells the story of what happened at the Assembly. That's on the YouTube channel. So there's a YouTube channel for the Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. And finally, I've put my email address there in case anyone would like to follow up with me on it with any specific questions after the call. So Daniela, I'll hand back to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Professor Torney, for such an insightful and really inspiring presentation. You have given us a really comprehensive overview of why democracy face unique challenges in addressing climate change issues, like, for example, time inconsistency or the pressure of powerful stakeholders with special interests. But you have also explained how democratic governance can evolve and tackle these pressing issues effectively. For example, using commitment devices like framework climate laws or deliberative democracy approaches. And this last case study on Ireland's children and young people assemblies on biodiversity loss was extremely powerful, an extremely powerful example of how deliberative democracy can strengthen our approach to climate action. So it's really inspiring for us as teachers to see how involving children and young people can bring fresh ideas and also at the same time ensure that also future generations have a voice in decision-making processes. So I guess that what this presentation has taught us is the importance of rethinking democratic structures to include more democracy and more deliberative processes like citizen assemblies, and also, as you said, co-design with youth and young people. Once again, Professor Torney, thank you very much for this illuminating lecture. We will now open the floor to questions. I'm going to give the floor to Mike Art, who will chair the Q&A session. Thank you again.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Torney. That, as Daniela said, that was very inspiring, and to have the example, of just how it all worked, and then to hear 2 years on that it's still having an impact. I think that was very inspiring. So thank you very much. If you would like to ask Professor a question or make a comment, if you'd like to raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, or if you would just like to put a question in the comments, we'll try and get as many of those in as possible in the next 20 minutes or so.
Mike, I can see there's one question there already that I can answer while people are thinking about other possible questions, and it's a question from Sarah: are these citizens' assemblies permanent? So that's a good question, and the answer is that the practice differs. So predominantly most citizens' assemblies have not been permanent, but there are a few examples. So in Belgium, for example, where citizens' assemblies have been established on a permanent basis, but for the most part, they are time limited. So they're set up to deliberate on a particular topic and over a particular time frame. Now, a couple of additional remarks on the question of permanence. One is a reflection from here in Ireland, which is that we don't have permanent citizens' assemblies, but what we do have now is effectively a tradition of running citizens' assemblies. So there have been 5 or 6 of them over, actually possibly more, at national level, not including the Children and Young People's Assembly. Now, they've each been temporary and time limited, but they add up to, like I described, a kind of a tradition of running citizens' assemblies on complex topics of public policy. The other thing to note is that there's an argument within the literature and within practice against having permanent citizens' assemblies, which is that if you come back to what I said during the talk, that the principle is that these aren't particularly motivated members of the public. They don't have a particular, they're not interest groups, they're not campaigners. They're supposed to be randomly selected people that you might pick out on the street. But what actually happens, and there's a lot of research around this, on the individual level impact, is that through their participation in a citizens' assembly, over time, the participants start to look less and less like average members of the public, because they've gone through this very unusual experience of learning in great detail about a public policy topic, and then being exposed to conversations with people that they probably wouldn't meet in their normal day-to-day lives, because they live in a different part of the country, or they're from a different, socioeconomic group, or whatever. And it's a very unusual and very unlike normal life experience. And so the argument against having permanent citizens' assemblies, at least citizens' assemblies that have permanent members or members over a very long period of time, is that it runs against that principle that the participants are ordinary members of the public, because they kind of cease to be ordinary members of the public and become very unusual as a result of participating in the process.
Yes, thank you, Professor Torney. There's another question come up in the chat there, which I suppose is a question that's on lots of people's minds. How do you actually hold, how do you hold politicians accountable, even when they promise to do things? I think you touched on that a bit, but perhaps you could say some more there.
Sure, yeah. And so the question in the chat is picking up on the specific example of the Citizens' Assembly that was run in France on climate change. And so without going into all the details, basically what happened there was that President Macron, in advance of the assembly, or the convention as it was called, in advance of it meeting and coming up with its recommendations, President Macron said, I commit to implementing all the recommendations. And then I think when he saw the recommendations, he somewhat regretted making that commitment. And there have been a lot of criticisms about the amount of the extent to which that commitment that he made was followed through on. And so if we look across the various countries, so I had the slide in the middle of my talk with kind of different examples of where citizens' assemblies have been run on climate change in countries like Finland and Denmark and France and Ireland and Scotland and the UK and a whole lot of other countries as well at different levels of governance. Actually, so probably the most challenging part is that interface between the assembly and the government process, the policy-making process. And there's no one model that that has become the standard way of doing that interface. So, as I described in the case of France, it was a prior commitment to implement all the recommendations, which then wasn't really followed through on. In Ireland, there has never been a commitment by government to implement the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. What the government has always said is we will respond to the recommendations, but not that we will necessarily follow through on them. And so, for example, there I had some screenshots of the report from a couple of weeks ago, where the government, in the case of some of the recommendations from the Children and Young People Assembly and the Adult Citizens Assembly, the government said it has decided not to progress recommendations. But on the other hand, there have been some examples at local level in Poland where the mayor, the city mayor, committed in advance to implementing automatically, without question, any recommendations that got more than 80% of the assembly members voting in favor. So all of which is to say there's a diversity of different approaches to handling this interface. The reason why, or one of the reasons why it's usually not, or why people object to a citizens' assembly having, if you like, executive power, that is the power to make policy, is that the members of an assembly are representative in a different sense to the way that elected politicians are representative. So they are representative in the sense of looking like the total population in terms of gender and ethnicity and geography and so forth. They're representative in that sense, but they're not representative in the sense of being accountable to members of the public in the way that elected politicians are accountable and representative. So the argument against giving a citizens' assembly the automatic power to make policy is that they don't have to they don't have to face the public out afterwards. So that's I might leave it there. I could talk more, but I can. I see there's another question in the chat.
Yeah, the next question, I think, really is a follow-on, is asking where's the power, or how do we shift power so that you have that link between the debate and then the forces that should accept the proposals and adopt those measures. So I suppose in the last part of my answer to the last question, I was implicitly making a case against, or I was at least articulating the view that there should be limitations on giving automatic power to a citizens' assembly, and that we should rather see it as an important way of inputting into the policy-making process, but not that those recommendations are automatically accepted by government. And I think if I had to express my own position, it would be some version of that argument. But what a process like this does is, if it's sufficiently high profile, it can provide. It can do a couple of different things. It can provide a focal point for campaigners. So, for example, the Irish Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change back in 2017 provided a set of recommendations, and afterwards the NGOs, the civil society groups, one of their campaign asks
became implement the Citizens Assembly recommendations in full. So it became a focal point for campaigning, and you know, a little bit easier than an NGO having to say, well, we want X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C. So and it can also so the recommendations can also sometimes give politicians a better understanding of what the public view on a topic is. And one very high profile, and probably the most high profile example of this from outside of the environmental field was so there was a Citizens Assembly that met in 2016 and 17 on the question of Ireland's then constitutional ban on abortion. And so the conventional wisdom in Ireland at the time was that the public was opposed to, so Ireland had introduced a ban on abortion in the early 1980s, that was so it was a constitutional amendment, so it was added to the constitution and could only be removed by referendum. And the conventional wisdom for decades was that the Irish population was relatively conservative on this question, and that they wouldn't support a proposal to remove the constitutional ban on abortion. And so the government convened a Citizens Assembly, and the Citizens Assembly, having heard both sides of the argument and all the evidence, they actually voted. So the Citizens Assembly voted 2/3 in favor of removing the constitutional ban on abortion. And when that decision was made public, so this was, I think, late 2016, a lot of the media and political commentators and so forth thought that there must have been something wrong with the process, because of course this wasn't what we understood the view of the Irish public to be. But actually, a year and a half later, in mid-2018, when a referendum was held on the very same question, the result of the popular referendum, so of the whole population, was within 1% of the result of the vote of the Citizens Assembly. So again, roughly 2/3 in favor of removing the constitutional ban. And so in a way, what the Citizens Assembly did was to give the political system a better understanding of the view of the public, and it wasn't what they were hearing necessarily from, you know, from organized interest groups.
Thank you. Alexander's put in a comment about accountability there, referencing the climate change bill in the UK. And just following on from what you were saying, I was wondering, do you see a possibility there for assemblies to feed into party manifestos, and then those manifestos to become legislation like the climate change bill that Alexander mentions there, that forces governments to basically be accountable?
Yes. So actually what happened in Ireland is almost exactly what you just described, Mike. So that, I won't go into the whole version of the story, but the Citizens Assembly on Climate Change took place in 2017 in Ireland, and the first recommendation was, now I'm not going to be able to get the wording exactly right, but it was roughly that climate change should be placed at the centre of government decision making, and that a new or existing body should be established to hold government to account. And it wasn't much longer than that. It was just a very broad, quite vague proposition. But then a parliamentary committee that was established to consider the recommendations from the Citizens Assembly developed that into a proposal to update and strengthen Ireland's climate legislation, basically to bring it into line with that UK legislation, to the Climate Change Act of 2008. And then in the next general election, multiple parties committed to implementing that, one of which was the Green Party, which formed part of a coalition government that was formed in 2020. And so then in 2021, new climate change legislation was enacted that looks actually quite similar to that UK climate change legislation of 2008. And the whole process can be traced back to the Citizens' Assembly. Now, of course, we don't know what the counterfactual is, what would have happened if the Citizens' Assembly hadn't taken place, but certainly you can draw a line, kind of a chain of events back from the 2021 climate legislation back to the Citizens' Assembly in 2017.
That's great. Thank you very much. We're running short of time, but I see Alexander's come into the chat. Would you like to have a brief comment on that?
It seems to be working. Okay. Thank you, and thank you for picking up on my comment. Nice to hear your references to your work, Prof. Torney. Most interesting. I was fortunate to be at the launch of the climate change bill at 10 Downing Street at the time. I headed up the communications for DEFRA on climate change in that period. But it was a while ago, so I'm just recalling from memory. I, in fact, worked with Miliband at the time, and he was quite passionate on citizens' engagement in this way, and it was very interesting to hear your comments on this. And it's very powerful. I guess the big question that came earlier was, how do we see accountability in the politicians? And my hope was that we would see other countries adopt similar period responsibilities per government, per phase of government, meaning administration, sorry. But maybe you could offer some advice on that.
Thanks, Alexander. That's really interesting. I'm trying to remember, was it David Miliband or Ed Miliband? Because I think they both held that portfolio at different points of time.
Yeah, David Miliband was very keen on the citizens' engagement. Very much.
Okay, very good. Yeah, well, and his brother is as well. That's really interesting to hear. There have been some papers written on where that UK Climate Change Act came from, and I think there was a Friends of the Earth campaign that started in 2005, and Tom York from Radiohead was involved. So I kind of remember bits of the story, and I think Bryony Worthington. Sorry, this is kind of getting into.
I worked with Bryony, in fact.
Right,
yes.
This is really getting into the detail, but it sounded like a really interesting story. So perhaps we might have a separate conversation about your recollections of that some other time. But thanks for the comment and question. So
do you mind? I'm sorry. I think
we're out of time.
We're kind of out of time. Thank you very much for I think a lot of the teachers have been working all week, and
of course, yeah.
But thank you very much. I'm going to pass you back to Daniela now to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So thank you, a huge thank you to you, Professor Torney, for your time, your expertise, your valuable perspective, and thank you also to our tutors and to all of you for your contributions and to the discussion. As usual, we are sharing the link to the Mentimeter poll. We would be very grateful if you could help us take a moment to assess today's event. We look forward to seeing many of you at our next webinar, which will be our second methodological webinar with Anastasia Ellis and Tom Dawson from the University of St. Andrews. And they will be speaking about how to teach sustainability through filmmaking. The seminar will be is scheduled on the 28th of November. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Professor Torney. I think this webinar was really interesting and inspiring. Thank you very much. And I can see that also from the stream of comments coming in. Thank you, Professor Torney.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you.